We rely on donations to keep the show in its current free and advertising-free format and are very, very grateful for any help that you can offer at all. We put no fixed cost on the donations and every little bit helps, so if you could spare even the price of a bottle of water every month. Isn't it ridiculous that we buy water in bottles? But we do, so if you could spare the price of a bottle of water every month, this will go a long, long way towards keeping us afloat. An interesting aside, here in Ireland, one of the reasons we drink so much bottled water, well certainly that I do, is because the water from the taps is fluoridated. Our donate button is on the website and your support and assistance is hugely appreciated. You can check us out on Facebook and Twitter. Get following and interacting with us with all your feedback, guest suggestions and other input. So, on to the show. Today's guest is Scott Onstott. Scott graduated from UC Berkeley with a bachelor's degree in architecture. He began his career doing manual drafting and later gained experience in several prominent engineering, architecture and interiors firms in San Francisco. He's taught over 45 semester courses at 3 Bay Area colleges and has written and edited dozens of technical computer books. Scott is also the maker of Secrets in Plain Sight, a video exploration of art, architecture and urban design, which unveils an unlikely intersection of geometry, politics, numerical philosophy, religious mysticism, new physics, music, astronomy and world history. On today's show we'll be talking about Secrets in Plain Sight and of course his newer written works as well. So Scott, you're very welcome to Alchemy Radio. How are things?
Things are good. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a great pleasure to have you on the show. You're based in British Columbia in Canada. What are things like there at the moment?
Well, it's sunny. It's a beautiful morning. We're enjoying the weather.
Well, for once I can say I can relate to that weather. I'm in Ireland, about 50 miles south of Dublin, and we have temperatures of over 25 degrees Celsius, which is almost unheard of in this country. So I'm in great form today. We're going to have a fantastic chat, obviously, about the work that it is you do. But for those that mightn't know, Scott, there's a question I ask everybody who comes on the show, and that's how did you get from where you were, any kind of starting point you like, to where you are now?
Okay, well, I started out, I got a degree in architecture at University of California, Berkeley. I worked in architecture for about 6 to 7 years in San Francisco. I started teaching students architectural software at the Academy of Art University. Did that for a number of years, started writing technical books on AutoCAD and Photoshop. Eventually moved to a remote island in Canada, and while I've been here, I've read a lot of interesting books and opened my mind to alternative possibilities, and eventually that led to me creating the Secrets in Plain Sight video series.
And let's talk about that video series for a second. A lot of people will be familiar with it, but some may not be. So how did your ideas for that come about, and were you surprised by how quickly it took off and the popularity that it subsequently gained?
I have been surprised by the popularity of it. I think there's almost 4 million people now who've seen it, and I get comments all the time from people who, it's really meant a lot to them. It's been kind of a transformative film or set of films. At first, though, for the first 6 months, almost no one saw it. It wasn't until I had my first interview with Henrik Palmgren on Red Ice Radio that I was sort of discovered. And then the popularity has just been growing ever since, and I've done, I think, something like 18 to 20 interviews to date on Secrets in Plain Sight. And I've written a couple of books on it as well. I've written a book called Taking Measure, Explorations in Number, Architecture, and Consciousness. And I just published a book called Quantification, and it's a book of illustrations or diagrams that basically get to the heart of what I've been discovering in Secrets in Plain Sight. That is, these uncanny connections or comparisons that I seem to be able to uncover in the world in terms of sacred geometry, distances between sacred sites, interesting comparisons, and mathematical codes.
And there are some fascinating discoveries that you have made over the years. And of course, quantification is something that will fascinate a lot of people because it's so visual. And it's almost like, for me, I think, a combination of the video and the book. I think some people find books a little bit more difficult than watching visual presentations because I think the visual stuff is a little bit more passive and people are quite comfortable with that. So Let's talk about Secrets in Plain Sight first off before we speak about the books. And you've mentioned the reaction to it already, but what made you decide to actually do this? Because obviously you were making your own discoveries and uncovering bits and pieces, and you were familiar with a lot of other people's work as well. But what made you decide to actually knuckle down and produce this for yourself and put it out there?
Well, the catalyst was really a conversation I had with an intuitive named Marcia Schaefer. And she told me that she basically had access to my higher self, if you will. And she told me it was very clear that I was going to be becoming a video producer. And at the time, she didn't know what the subject was or what kind of movie I would make. Mm-hmm. But that was for sure I was going to do that. And I hung up the phone with her. That was in 2009. And I really was dumbfounded. Wow, what am I going to do? And I was at kind of a crossroads in my life, and I felt like I needed a new direction. And that catalyzed me to doing some soul searching to find out what if I was going to make a movie, what would it be about? And then I sort of got a download of the script of Secrets in Plain Sight Volume 1 very quickly, and in a month's time or so I had written the whole thing. And then it just took me, the remainder of an entire year to put it all together and do all the technical side of making the movie.
That's a really, really quick length of time. I mean, you must have shocked yourself with that.
I really was. I was kind of amazed. I put in more work, I think, than I've ever done on any project in architecture or in training videos. I just devoted to creating Secrets in Plain Sight because I could really only afford to take a year off. My business was doing well at the time with selling tutorial videos, and so I had a luxury to take some time off and do this creative project. And it came together. It took me exactly 1 year. And then I made Volume 2 the following year, following couple of years, I guess it took me. See, Volume 1 is almost 4 hours long, so it's really like a double feature that I've given away free. It's on YouTube. And then Volume 2 is an hour and a half, and that one is only available if you purchase it. And it's sort of a deepening of the message in Secrets in Plain Sight Volume 1.
And tell us a little bit, for those who mightn't have seen any of the videos yet, about the information that's contained therein as a kind of a starting point and a framework then for the conversation that we're having.
Okay, yes. Secrets in Plain Sight is about patterns in art, architecture, urban design, and the cosmos. I look at all kinds of things in the series and look at all over the Western world primarily. And notice these uncanny patterns and alignments between sacred sites. It's kind of hard for me to summarize it all in a very brief statement. It's really it's a gateway into a wealth of information. It's a different way of looking at the world, noticing these so-called secrets in plain sight that are there all around, but you just maybe haven't perceived them.
It absolutely is. And just to jump forward a little bit, there was one chapter of the book, Taking Measure, Explorations in Number, Architecture and Consciousness, that really stood out to me. And I have heard you speak about it before, but I think it will be fascinating to a lot of people. So to give people a kind of an example, it's the chapter entitled Honeycomb and Apple, which is basically about the relationship of 6 to 5. So for anyone new to this information, I think if we have a little chat about that, it might kind of whet the appetite and show people just how fascinating the most seemingly normal or mundane things that we take for granted can actually be. So tell us about that relationship and where honeycomb and an apple come in.
Okay, basically in my work I get into number quality in addition to quantity, but quality is the essential nature of numbers themselves. And that's what I'm kind of getting into in that chapter, the honeycomb and the apple. I have a copy of the book here. I'm just going to look through it. It's when you look at 5, it is the apple. If you cut an apple across its equator, you have a pentagram. It's an uncommon thing to do, and I suggest you try it. There's a beautiful pentagram inside every apple. It's sort of the secret about the apple. And it makes me even wonder about the symbolism of the forbidden fruit. And, the sort of the secret inside is the pentagram. And to me, the pentagram resonates with all things that are alive. It's all about that. Whereas 6 is more of a structural kind of thing, and I symbolize that with the honeycomb, just recognizing the hexagonal pattern there. Everything from something as small as a honeycomb up to the giant hexagon on the North Pole of Saturn. Another example of 6. But basically 6 boils down to being a structural element, something that's the background for life. And so when we compare 6 and 5 by taking a simple ratio of 6 over 5, a whole host of numerical curiosities come about. For example, let's see, 6 over 5 times phi squared is approximately equal to pi. So there's kind of a mathematical connection between two of the most important numbers in math.
Yeah.
And then 6/5 times 33,333,333 meters is equivalent to the Earth's polar circumference. And that kind of is a connection to the repetitive digits phenomenon that I talk about a lot, where you find a string of 3s or 4s or 5s or what have you. They seem to be kind of a key to getting in deeper into the numerical basis of reality. In my philosophy, I sort of share my ideas with ancient philosophers such as Pythagoras, who looked at number as really the bedrock of the universe.
And many observers would claim that numbers are, I suppose, the universal language, that anybody can decode them, irrespective of what your native tongue might be. Would you kind of agree with that? And do you think it's a language that extends far deeper and far further than any language based on an alphabet might do?
Well, that's an interesting question, and number and geometry are really the universal language. You know, if there were people on another planet, they would presumably communicate most effectively using, if they were trying to communicate with us, say, they might communicate using geometry or number, because it is such a universal. However, language also has a numerical basis, and there are many traditions, such as gematria, where you can convert each letter into a numerical value. And by doing so, you can get down to its numeric equivalent. There's also a way of looking at reality using a lens called the quadrivium. And traditionally that is, those are 4 arts: number theory, music, geometry, and astronomy. And another way of thinking about that all boils down to number. So number theory is number in itself. Geometry is number in space. Music is number in time. And astronomy, or rather the manifest universe, is number in space and time.
So the common link is numerology there.
That's right. Exactly. Number, it's like Pythagoras said, all is number. And in some way, there's really profound truth in that.
And there seems to be, and I find it fascinating, the link with I suppose the language that we use today, be it English or French or whatever you might use, but the spoken language and numerology, because that's something that not many people are aware of. And we've had Marty Leeds on the show before, and he goes into this in some depth. But there's a big crossover between the work that you guys do. So what can you tell us about how the patterns are discovered and how they're formulated? Because it's not something that everybody can immediately see. And I'm fascinated as to how it was that these patterns were discovered in the first place. So what's your experience, Scott?
Well, it's sort of a mysterious process how things get discovered, or how I discover things. I don't know. I don't exactly know. It just, I'm following my intuition. And sometimes I'll just have a little niggling sense that I need to measure the distance between two significant sites, or I should calculate the area of something, or whatever it is. It's just a kind of a gut feeling or a hunch. And it would be very easy to ignore that kind of feeling because it is so quiet and subtle. But I've been totally blown away by this sense. For example, just the other day, I had a sense that I should really take a look at Cleopatra's Needle in London, and I had a sense that I should measure the distance between the location of the ancient Egyptian obelisk there on the Victoria Embankment, and measure the distance from there to where it used to be in Alexandria, Egypt. And I was totally blown away because that distance is exactly 3,333.33 kilometers.
Well, there are all the threes again. We're seeing this recurring time and time again when you link sites.
That's right. And so when I see something like that, I'm totally blown away. It's like, how could that's so non-random, And yet, when you start to ask, how could that be, then you kind of run into a lot of problems, because it seems kind of implausible that they would have measured that distance so exactly and been able to place the obelisk there in London. And if you think about it a little more, you realize, okay, well, the position of London is really calling into question there. It's not just the position of the obelisk within the city, it's the actual general location of the city. And so I don't think there's a conspiracy there where somebody located London, thousands of years ago in relation to this ancient Egyptian obelisk. But nevertheless, that distance sort of shows you that there's consciousness involved. It's not random. And so then, you're led to speculate about how could that be? Was it aliens that did it? Was it higher dimensional beings who encode these things? I don't really have an answer to that. I can only speculate. But I think it's really fascinating to kind of ponder these questions.
I think let's speculate on it for a while, because when you look at the work that it is you're doing and the number of correlations that you draw, so for example, Alexandria and London, and you've all these seemingly far off places. I know there are a lot of links with ancient sites in Ireland and Egypt and again and all over the world, and it happens time and time again, and the same numbers are recurring all the time. And it's way beyond coincidence. A lot of people believe in coincidence, but I mean, there comes a time where you have to say, no, there's something at play or at work here that we don't really understand. So as somebody who has had, I suppose you've been at the coalface for so long with examining the patterns, how would you care to speculate, or in what direction would you care to speculate with regard to what was taken and what knowledge must have been held by whoever it was responsible for what went on years and years ago? Because there's always this assumption that we're at the pinnacle of civilization now and we know everything that there is to know, and we certainly know everything that came before, but that's clearly not the case. So what do you think went on, Scott?
Well, this is total speculation, but I think that our ancestors understood the world in a completely different modality than we do today. Mm-hmm. And their understanding it had much more wisdom in it. Yeah. Rather than the data that we seem to have accumulated today, they understood things in a more comprehensive and systematic way. So I get hints of that by looking at ancient metrology and these positions of monuments that someone certainly understood that, and it gets into, I guess, your own philosophy. If you believe that everything is physical and there's nothing beyond the physical, if everything is made of atoms, then the wisdom had to come from our ancestors or from physical aliens, right?
Yeah.
But if you're open to more subtle realms where there could be intelligences that are more like spirits, then the wisdom could have come from these other beings and been passed to our human ancestors? I don't know. But I noticed that even in my own life, I will unwittingly encode something and then be blown away by it. And I think that's kind of the mechanism that happens quite often. I think a lot of architects will design a building in a certain way, and they might not even be aware of the incredible things they've encoded in there. At least that's my kind of working hypothesis.
So there is something subconscious at work there, you reckon?
Yeah, I think that consciousness, actually I think that the universe is consciousness, and that, this is my personal opinion, I guess, that we have it completely 180 degrees backwards. We think that consciousness emerges in the brain, and that there's a real world out there. I kind of look at it the opposite way, that the world is something that we've imagined, and that there's only really one being here, and that we've imagined all of the universe in its incredible complexity, including the whole cast of characters, including Scott. Scott is a kind of fiction that has been imagined. And if you can follow me there, that way of looking at reality would explain all of these strange numerical coincidences that we seem to find, because that's the way we've imagined everything, was using number and geometry. And it makes sense that we'd have these sort of harmonics at different scales that reveal that fact.
And to look at those harmonics with, for example, the alphabet that we use on an everyday basis, it's fascinating to look at some of the work that's been done on decoding letters and numbers. And as you say, it all stems back to numbers. But even the language that is used, for example, when we spell a word, even the word itself, the spell, to cast the spell. And there is so much evidence, again, beyond coincidence, that when language was first developed or formed, that there is a hidden message or a hidden consciousness in there, or subconsciousness even, that means that we're constantly using a code or a spell without even being aware of it on an everyday basis. And that has some kind of effect on everyone else around us and everything else around us, which could possibly explain why it is that an architect designs a building, and that because they speak English and that code has been passed down to them, it's embedded in them on the conscious level as well as the subconscious, which you've mentioned. What do you think about that?
I think that's the way it is, yeah. We're just slowly becoming aware of these things that are hidden in plain sight, and we often kind of assume that we're responsible for them, but ultimately we are. If you subscribe to the notion that all is consciousness, after all, we're responsible for the whole universe. But our physical minds and bodies aren't necessarily responsible for these patterns, and yet we're inextricably connected with them. It's kind of a mystery and a beautiful work of art at the same time.
It is, and it's absolutely fascinating, because whether we realize it or not, we are a part of that and are creating all the time using these codes. That's
right. And my work is just kind of scratching the surface of those codes that seem to be around us in such profusion. And I find it, when I discover something like that, Cleopatra's Needle example, I really have a good feeling. It's like, wow, the universe is patterned in this incredible way, and it's even using the units of measure that we're using today. It's just unbelievable.
Fascinating in itself. And you speak about things like the decimal system and these systems that were devised to measure. And again, the coincidences continue there. So let's talk about that for a little while. For example, the relationships between particular units and other units that we use. I mean, we would imagine that they would have no link and that they're just put in place to make things easier for us or for commerce or whatever it might be. But the patterns all remain and they're steadfast. So what are some of these patterns and how have they been uncovered?
Well, let me give you an example of that, using the Great Pyramid as the key. If you look at the Great Pyramid's elevation, it forms a triangle. And the angles, the two base angles are equal. They're 51 degrees, 51 minutes. And if you were to draw that triangle across the Earth so that the base was across the equator of the Earth, and then draw the rest of the triangle, the point of the apex of the pyramid would be above the Earth. In fact, if you were to bring the moon down to the surface of the Earth and draw it there tangent to the Earth circle, the apex of the pyramid would go right to the center of the moon. So the pyramid is kind of a key to the Earth-Moon system. And that knowledge is geometric, but it also connects with different units of measure. So, for example, if you measure the combined diameters of Earth and Moon going through the poles, that is equal to 10,000 times 5 kilometers. And that's super accurate. That's 99.97% accurate. So that's a beautiful thing. 10,000 kilometers times 5 is equal to the combined polar diameters of Moon and Earth. Now, that's so beautiful. It's such an even number. It seems like perhaps that is how the metric system came about, even though there's we know from history that the metric system was designed just using the Earth and measuring the distance around the surface of the Earth from the equator to the pole was defined as 10,000 kilometers. So you can just think about that geometrically, that kind of quarter arc is equal to the combined distances of diameters of Earth and Moon. And then this system also encodes miles. The actual base perimeter of the Great Pyramid is 1,007.7 yards. And the mean diameters of Moon and Earth, that is accommodating the equatorial bulge of the Earth, so the mean diameters of Moon and Earth is 10,077 miles. So it uses the same digits as the Great Pyramid's base perimeter, 10077 miles compared to 1007.7 yards. So it's changing scales, changing units, but it's the digits themselves that are significant. And that's what I find in my work, is that it's the numbers that matter. And in some way they're scale invariant and even unit invariant. It's really strange in a way, but it seems to be the way that things are done. It's almost like a number game that has been played on us or through us to encode these units of measure. Another example, connecting the Earth with these repetitive threes, is that the Sun is 333,000 times more massive than the Earth, and the Earth's diameter bulges 0.33% beyond a perfect circle, and the Earth's orbit of the Sun bulges 3.3% beyond a perfect circle.
Amazing.
We have 33 bones in our spine. So there's a lot of examples like that. Like in religion, Jesus lived for 33 and a third years, and he is said to have performed 33 miracles. And in Buddhism, the Great Retreat lasts for 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. So these repetitive threes are a kind of key to understanding the universe. And I find so many examples of these things in different areas. For example, the speed of sound. The speed of sound in air varies with temperature. And it turns out that the speed of sound at 3.3 degrees Celsius is equal to 333.3 meters per second. Isn't that crazy?
It's absolutely crazy, and the more examples that you give, the crazier it gets, because I think many of us, including myself, we start from this kind of base assumption that everything is just random. But when you throw out these so-called coincidences, or coincidences as many people would perceive them, it becomes an impossibility that they are coincidental, because they appear time and time again, and no matter how small the example or how big, for example, you've gone as far as the sun there, they just happen over and over and over again. And presumably our ancestors knew stuff that we don't know, or that some kind of information or knowledge that we've lost. So do you think it has been lost? Because I have my doubts personally, because you do see again these kind of occult links and these similarities with ancient structures occurring again and again and again in modern society and modern buildings and structures and that kind of thing as well. So do you think there has been a protection of that knowledge, or a deliberate hiding of the knowledge, or what's the situation there as you see it, Scott?
Well, I think that the Freemasons traced their intellectual heritage back to ancient Egypt, and it seems that everything in my research points back to ancient Egypt. And I would speculate that the knowledge of ancient Egypt actually came from a previous human civilization that Plato called Atlantis. And basically, at that time, they understood things like I was saying before, in a more holistic, systematic way, that they understood sort of how the puzzle pieces fit together in a much more satisfying way than we tend to do today. Mm-hmm. And bits of that knowledge have been passed down, such as the significance of the number 33. And that's echoed in the Scottish Rite, that being the highest degree. But it doesn't necessarily mean that people understand really the significance of that now. It's almost like we have these fragments of knowledge, and it's our job now to kind of try to reverse engineer that, or piece it back together. Once in a while, the pieces kind of fit together, and you go, aha, that's how it is. I get it. And it seems like a great advancement when these pieces fit together. But it's a work in progress. I feel like in some way I'm helping, in my part, to reconstruct an ancient art and science.
I think so. And you've spoken in the past about Masonic trigger numbers, and since you have mentioned Freemasonry there, let's talk about them for a little bit, because there are numbers that come up time and time again, and you have linked them to Freemasonic buildings and structures and lots of other stuff there as well. So what is a trigger number, for starters, for anybody who mightn't have heard of one before?
A trigger number? I don't really use that term, but I think you mean a number of significance, such as 33.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so the way I classify it is basically there are repetitive digits. 33 is one example. 666 is another such example. But there's also something that I call the cosmic sequence, and that is a sequence of a discrete number of terms, not too many. It starts with the number 27, and then each subsequent term is the double. So 27, 54, 108, 216, 432, 864, 1728, and 3456. So this so-called cosmic sequence has incredible resonance with the universe, and I wrote a blog post called The Cosmic Sequence that goes into that in some detail. So that's another code or key to the universe, in addition to the repetitive digits. And also another one would be transcendental numbers, such as pi or E, and also the golden number phi. I would include in that list as being keys to a lot of the symbolism in architecture that I find. When I do an analysis of the architecture, I find these keys. For example, I think one of the most significant things in my book, Quantification, has to do with analysis of the Great Pyramid's elevation. And if you there's a couple ways of doing it that I show, but perhaps the easiest way for spoken word is just to explain if you inscribe an equilateral triangle inside that elevation, the edge length just so happens to be 555.5 feet, and that is equal to 6,666 inches. And so here we see this repetitive digit key appearing within the Great Pyramid in imperial units. And, the origins of the imperial system of measure, at least they go back to the 16th century, but we kind of are at a loss to finding when that was invented. But it seems really implausible that feet and inches and miles would go back thousands of years further to the Great Pyramid, and yet here I find this encoded in there. It just seems so clear that these units were used at that time, and perhaps they were lost and rediscovered. I don't know, but there they are.
It does seem absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, and John Greaves, who lived a generation before Isaac Newton, surveyed the Great Pyramid, and he came to the conclusion that the English foot was at the root of its measurement system, as implausible as that sounds. But there you have it. So
could it be that whatever measurement was used was then adopted at a later stage by the British Empire? Or, I mean, it's very hard to say. As you say, there is a huge amount of reverse engineering that is involved there to try and decode exactly what it is, or to transcribe the meaning of what's going on, because it's right. It's all embedded in there. Isaac Newton was the guy who figured out the equation of gravity. And he studied the Great Pyramid because he thought it would encode the dimensions of the Earth. And if he could find the actual size of the Earth, then he could calculate his gravitational constant, what he called G. So one thing I wanted to point out was that I was looking into the gravitational constant G, and a recent measurement that was published, I think it was published in Science, was they did a more accurate calculation of the gravitational constant, and they gave a value with a tolerance, of a very small amount, like it could be between these two numbers. Well, within that tolerance is the value 6.666 times 10 to the negative 11th, which I found really interesting, that actually gravity could be a repetitive string of sixes. And that really would be kind of satisfying to me, in that these physical constants actually are using these codes, And again, these codes, in particular the number 6, it seems to appear in so many different places that you would imagine have no links. For example, a barcode, or the World Wide Web, the www, and the link to Hebrew there with the number 6. They're just absolutely everywhere. So whether it's something organic or something man-made, it just seems to occur over and over again.
That's right. And so I take notice of that type of pattern occurring, and I kind of keep that in my own sort of mental database. And then when I see it happen again, I'll then make a comparison and say, okay, that's significant. That's essentially sort of at the core of what I'm doing, is I'm recognizing patterns, and I'm able to recognize patterns in different phenomena that most people would immediately disregard, because they would say, oh, that's just used, the Great Pyramid couldn't be encoded in feet and inches, so I'm not going to think about that. But why not? Why not just open your mind to these possibilities, and then sort of amazing harmonies or resonances occur?
Yes, I think so. And so many of them seem to be then in harmony with the earth and celestial bodies and that kind of thing. So it's not just men building things or women building things on the surface of the earth that are linked. And what fascinates me about that is it's almost like you're building a map, and it's like a fractal map. And correct me if I'm wrong here, this is just my perception of the work that you do and that others do along these lines. It's almost like a kind of an organic fractal that appears using numbers instead of physical drawings or patterns. So if people look at the shape of a tree and then the shape of the veins on a leaf, quite often they're extremely similar. So if you look at the relationship between the example you gave earlier, Cleopatra's Needle in London and Alexandria in Egypt, or the sun and the moon, or the sun and the earth in relation to the moon, all these things, it's like a fractal pattern begins to emerge. And for me, it has to go beyond the physical, and it has to go into a kind of a universal and then conscious realm. Is that, would that be linear with your way of thinking with regard to the bigger picture and the pieces of the jigsaw that you are starting to put together, Scott?
Yes, I agree. I think basically this type of information guides you to seeing that these patterns aren't random, and that they come from consciousness, and that the only way they really could happen is if everything was patterned by consciousness. And, depending on your outlook, you can view that as the work of God or the work of demons, or you can look at it as, I said earlier, that the universe is consciousness. Or you can also have more of a conspiratorial attitude, that the Freemasons are doing this, or the Illuminati is doing it, or the Archons are behind it. It's really quite diverse in how people feel about these things. But it does get you to ask these deeper questions. And I think if I'm a success, then that's what I'm succeeding at, is getting people to look beyond the physical and to question reality a little bit more and say, wow, there's really something more to it. And our explanation that everything is random and purposeless just doesn't hold any water, really. It doesn't make any sense when you see these patterns. These are sort of the antidote to that kind of nihilism.
And I think an evidence-based antidote, because it can't be denied. People can choose to ignore if they so wish, but a fact remains a fact, and these links and correlations are being drawn constantly. So, I mean, if one wants to use a mind that is open in any way, they have to be examined and have to be taken into account, and I think that's the only way we can get any kind of an accurate reading of what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. It's worthy of study, and careful. Take a careful look at it using rationality. You see, a lot of my work is kind of delving into what are thought of as mystical areas, or areas of synchronicity or uncanny connections.
Yeah.
But I'm able to maintain rationality through that process and not just become superstitious about it. And I think that's a key, is we now have these rational tools that we can use to look at these unusual phenomena, and that can tell us something very deep about the world that we live in. I'm thinking of a comparison that I made in quantification. I think it's the last image in the book. There's a couple of comparisons there. One is the magnetic field of the Earth, as illustrated by NASA, is this beautiful kind of cloak-like structure surrounding the Earth. And I compared that with the magnetic field of the human heart. And there's definitely kind of a geometric similarity there of the heart field going. It has kind of a circle that kind of goes around the head, and a larger kind of egg-shaped thing that goes around the lower part of the body. So it has a similar look to the magnetic field of the Earth. And then when you think of the word Earth and the word heart, it's really, first of all, they're the exact same letters. And if you just take the H off the end of Earth and put it on the front, you have heart.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of profound, that, our heart is in some way a fractal of the Earth, and we have this love for the Earth, another comparison I made was there's this picture that was taken of the sun and the moon from a spacecraft that was kind of far from Earth. And in that photograph, the moon is quite a bit smaller than the sun disk. Normally from the Earth, of course, the moon and the sun disks are equal size, which is kind of a miracle in itself. But in this particular photo from the Stereo B spacecraft, the moon is like a small disk in the middle of the sun. And then that kind of rang a bell in my mind that I had seen that before. And I was able to find that picture. It's in Gray's Anatomy, and it's a picture of the human ovum surrounded by the corona radiata, which are these cells that kind of radiate out from the egg that look very much like the sun. And then inside of that egg, you have the nucleus of the cell, which looks just like the moon in the astronomical imagery. So here we have this kind of fractal repetition of something we see as above and then something we see so below. And this is the kind of wisdom that I'm kind of tapping into with this this work I'm doing in Secrets in Plain Sight. Is sometimes I get these really great aha moments like that that are kind of a key to realizing that we're part of this pattern that extends in both directions. We're kind of in the middle. It goes down into the cell and it goes out into the cosmos. And it's a thing of beauty. It's alive. The universe is alive. Matter, Another thing is that you can look at matter as this inert substance that's separate from you, which is the kind of prevailing notion in science. Or if you look at the universe as something that's in you, and that now you become the deity, matter is alive, just as alive as you are. And in fact, we have evidence that this is the case. In quantum physics, they know that the atom is composed of 99.999999999% nothing. There's actually no substance to it at all. It's all a work of imagination. And yet we haven't really understood the implications of that for, like, well, then who am I? If the atoms of my body don't exist really, then who am I? But it doesn't take anything away from your lived life and who you are in this life. It's just as real to you. It's really just a perspective shift is what I'm talking about.
I think so, and I think as well that nature leaves us little clues should we care to open our eyes or our minds to them a little bit. Just as you were speaking about correlations between nature and the human body and different numbers, I was just reminded of a study that I read before showing the links and the physical clues that exist within nature when trying to let us know what's good for us and what we should consume, or how we can heal our bodies or reach maximum physical potential that are there in nature. For example, one that springs to mind is the humble walnut. And if you crack open the walnut and have a look at the actual nut inside itself, it looks like a human brain. It's no coincidence then that the walnut is particularly good for brain management and brain development and that kind of thing. And another example I think was a kidney bean and the kidneys. The mushroom, when you slice it in half, the shape of a human ear. And again, very, very good for hearing. And again, it just reminded me of those little clues that nature leaves us. And it's almost like you have this uncanny ability to take the clues and combine them with other little clues that you found that were seemingly unconnected and just join those dots, which gives this pattern or this fascinating picture or the overall jigsaw that very few people have managed to do so far.
Yeah, well, thank you. I feel sometimes at my best I'm on that path, and I come out with these coincidences, these keys that help us look at our lives in a different way and look at the universe as an organism, as a consciousness, rather than something that's dead. And I think that makes all the difference into your life outlook. do you live in a universe that supports you and supports patterns, and or do you live in one that really essentially there's no meaning at all? I think it's easy to make the choice there.
I think absolutely, and I think most people are on a quest to discover for themselves, whether they realise it or not, that things aren't dead and meaningless, and nobody likes that idea. I mean, we're predisposed towards the spiritual and the mystical, and I think modern society kind of cloaks that or throws a veil over it quite often, and a lot of people become overly rational or overly physical in their way of thinking or logical. And I think the work that you're doing is a really good kind of an introduction to opening the right brain through some left brain correlations, or in a way that might appeal to those who are fascinated or almost locked in with logic and scientific rules and that kind of thing. That's, for me, it's the link between the two sides of the brain, almost the left and the right brain, and people quite often assume that they are mutually exclusive, and I don't think that's the case at all. But the one body of work I have come across that seems to link them best, for me, and I can only speak for me, is the work that you're doing, and in particular quantification.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that that's a great way of describing it, is the kind of connection of left and right hemispheres, connection of art and science. It's, I think in the last several hundred years, humanity has developed its left brain capacities in a great way with science and technical development. And that was necessary. And in a way, science still retains a trace of its beginnings as a reaction to religion, as a reaction to kind of the irrationality of superstition. It was necessary for us to close that down and say, okay, that's all hogwash now, and we're not going to think of that anymore. We're going to test everything, and we're going to be very left-brained about it. But I think we kind of sold ourselves a bit short there, and we threw out too much. I think that we can use our rational capacities to look at kind of woo-woo subjects, or to look at life through a right brain filter more.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of our natural growth, is to reconnect with our heritage there, that we've temporarily, at least in the last few hundred years, put aside. But I think it's a time of reintegration now, of connecting left and right brains. And that's really kind of the secret of Freemasonry, is in balance. And it's also going back to some, like the Ida and Pingala currents in the spine. When you have them in balance, the Kundalini energy will rise up the spine. So it's sort of like balancing the masculine and feminine energies within you. And when you have that balance right, then suddenly you're able to resonate with these patterns as above, so below, and you start to see these patterns more. I don't know about you, but when I feel like I'm on my path, I look at the clock and it's 11:11 or 3:33 or something like that. It happens just way more than would be statistically possible. I have this kind of connection with the clock, or with the odometer in my car. These things just happen when I'm in the right frame of mind.
Yeah, I experienced the very same thing. The ones for me, funny that you mention it, are 11:11 and then the 24-hour clock 22:22. They seem to be the ones that occur. I'm at my most productive. I go into, I suppose, the zone would be the words I would use at those times more frequently, I notice, than any other time. And you mentioned as well then resonance. Have you noticed any patterns or correlations that link to the Schumann resonance and the number 7.83 and the Earth's magnetic resonance?
Yeah, I think in Secrets in Plain Sight Volume 1, I mentioned the connection there is that middle C, which is sort of in the center of our range of hearing, is 33 octaves above the Schumann resonance. I can't remember exactly. It's 33 octaves or 32 overtones, or maybe I have them reversed. But basically, you have a 33 and a 32 there, connecting the earth with human hearing. And I think that's very beautiful. It mirrors the degree structure in the Scottish Rite, for example. On the Great Seal of the United States, there are 32 feathers on one wing of the eagle and 33 on the other wing. And 33 plus 32 is 65, which kind of connects with the 6 and 5 analysis that I've done. These patterns are there, and just waiting for us to delve into and unlock their resonances and their meaning in the world.
And just to make a popular cultural reference as well, there are a number of people who are doing work now that I haven't properly delved into myself at this stage, but music is my profession, and some of the musical works that have stood the test of time, I mean, from Mozart to Bach to more recently artists such as the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, people like that, the notes that they're using with their biggest songs and biggest works, there are patterns that are mirrored in the natural world, and again the Schumann resonance comes into it, and it seems to be those that are most harmonious with these overall vibrations and energies and resonances are the tracks that embed themselves in people's consciousness the most, and hence become the biggest sellers for record labels or whatever. But I think there's no doubt that there is a massive link there as well between music and, you mentioned the TV show Grey's Anatomy, and the symbolism used, and we see symbolism used time and time and time again. And there's no coincidence, because when people such as yourself or Marty Leeds or any other people who decode symbols and who manage to apply a certain numerical language to these symbols, and when they do that, you can see why they're being used and what they are linked to, be it Egyptian times or the pyramid or whatever. There's always a code, and they're following that code. So no matter where we look or what we do or what it is that we're into in our daily lives, the codes remain the same. So for me, it's music, and I notice various patterns and bits and pieces in music. And that just fascinates me, because again, it's a link between us. It's a link between somebody who might be, I don't know, an Inuit at the North Pole and somebody who's down in the bottom of Argentina. Those links remain, no matter how different their obvious cultural leanings are.
That's right. Are you aware of in music, there's the move to retune instruments to 432 hertz as opposed to 440 hertz?
Absolutely, and again, why the 440 was used in the first place is, I mean, there is speculation that it was used to disrupt the natural harmony of music and to change the brain state, which made it easier to sell ideas through music to people.
And I think there's a kind of conspiracy theory that there was actually a Nazi who was the one who did that change.
That's right, yeah. I don't have it to hand. I'll see if I can look it up here while we speak.
Yeah, I think there's some evidence that might have been the case. But by shifting the musical tuning point to 432 hertz, it connects with the cosmic sequence. You know, the sun's radius is 432,000 miles. And when I say something like that, if you look it up, you'll find that that's something like 99.8% accurate. But the left brain will look that up on Wikipedia and say, that's wrong. It's not exactly 432,000 miles. You see? It's 433 whatever. But really what you should do is figure out how close that is. And if it's 99.8% accurate, that's pretty good, you know? But we have this, our left brain has this tendency to reject things that don't perfectly fit in the box.
Yeah.
And the right brain has the capacity to notice correlations and to hold that correlation as potentially carrying meaning. And so what I'm trying to do is bring those together and not just have wild meaning like, it's about 300,000 miles, so I'm going to call it 432. Well, that's too far. That's not even close.
Yeah.
So you have to, look at these things with the right brain, but with a critical eye. So you have to use the left brain with it to bring these correlations into focus. to having a fine point on it.
Definitely. And it always fascinates me how somebody who might, just as you've described, dispel a notion because of that slight 0 point whatever % calculation that's out. But these very same people in everyday commerce are happy to round amounts up to the nearest 5 or the nearest 10. So, I mean, the capacity is there for us to do it. It's ingrained, it's inbuilt. And I think a lot of it just comes down to somebody's paradigm or perspective.
Yeah, that's right. Let me just give you a few 108s that I found in the cosmos. The polar diameter of Saturn is 108,000 kilometers. The Saturn's orbital period is 10,800 days. Venus's orbital distance is 108 million kilometers from the Sun. Earth's orbital velocity is 108,000 kilometers an hour. The Sun's diameter is approximately 108 Earth diameters. Earth averages 108 solar diameters from the Sun, and the Moon averages 108 lunar diameters from the Earth. So we have all these 108s, and then there's 108 stitches on a baseball. The top of the FM radio dial is 108 megahertz. Yeah. We have these 108s all over the place. It's one of these numbers that subconsciously we kind of groove with it, and it's part of that cosmic sequence. It's almost musical in its appeal somehow. It's just uncanny. It's one of these keys that the more of these so-called coincidences that you see, the more you can take it take it seriously.
Absolutely. And just to go back to music for a second, we were talking about the 44 hertz. I found online here Dr. Richard Walashek, who was a Nazi engineer. He was the guy who first discovered that they could develop a sonic cannon that would, using pulse waves at 44 hertz, literally shake a person apart from the inside out, just using sound wave.
Nice.
There you go. And I mean, that's essentially the frequency that is used for modern music. If you tune into a radio, that's the frequency that you're listening to. If you look at the frequencies that are used to encode MP3s, it's the same thing. And it's just fascinating to see where that came from.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be nice to kind of go with that trend to shift music back to something more in harmony with the whole pattern. I think it might have a profound influence on people. I've heard the story that in ancient Egypt, the government regulated music, which seems very kind of draconian to us today. But they didn't want music that was really disturbing. They wanted music that was harmonious, and consequently, their civilization lasted for 3,000 years. I wonder if that had anything to do with music, but it might have, because it kept people connected. And I've also heard the story that in ancient times they had like a 24-hour chanting that would go on, and when people got tired, more people would come in, and they'd keep the chant going, and essentially that created an enchantment on the land where everyone was in phase with each other, and they were all essentially in harmony with each other. And so when you're in harmony with your fellow humans, you feel that you have more in common with them. You want to cooperate more than you want to compete. And I think that's a beautiful way of using music to stay in tune with everyone else.
I think so. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, and I think you've also uncovered large portions of the code to harmony. And I think that, to me, it seems to be what your work is about, or where it's leading, and that of so many other people out there as well, because we all want to reach a harmonious state. It's what's best for us, for our conscious levels as singular entities, or as a part of one universal consciousness, which is what I believe we are a part of, as opposed to being individuals per se. I think we can have an individual perspective on the overall bigger picture, and that's what we're doing at the moment. But I think essentially the work that you're doing is the code to that, and I think if more people are willing to look in that direction and to actually take on board the pieces of the jigsaw that are being linked for the first time in a long time, most certainly, certainly in the mainstream anyway, I think people will derive benefits from it. And if even it's a more open mind or a more open approach to the world around us, I think people, if they look at things with an open mind, suddenly start to notice for themselves. And I think that is far weightier or meatier for somebody than necessarily watching a YouTube video or reading a book or listening to you or me chatting about this. I think when people start to experience and feel things for themselves, that's when they really begin to grow, and that their own resonance starts to change. And harmony is a key word. We've used it so many times in this conversation. For me, that is at the centre of everything that it is that we all should be doing, and most certainly is at the centre of your work as I see it.
Yeah, I think harmony is one of the four most important studies in the quadrivium, and it's one of the keys to the universe. Essentially, is music, for sure. This discussion reminds me of a building that's being constructed in Manhattan right now called 432 Park Avenue, and I wrote a blog post about that one. It's interesting that one, they tore down a building that used to be called 440, and the address was 440 something. Let me look it up. It was 440 Park.
Yeah.
And the owner purchased that building for $440 million and tore it down, and then changed the address to 432 Park. And that's interesting, because essentially he's shifting from standard tuning to the Pythagorean tuning. And the building height is 864 times 5 feet. Each floor is 8640 square feet. There are 2016 windows. So these are all members of the cosmic sequence. 216, 864, 432. The building happens to be 33,333 feet to the Statue of Liberty.
Just goes on cool. And on, yeah.
And 333 kilometers to the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., which is sort of one of the centers of the kind of cult of 33, if you will.
Mm. Do we know who owns this building, Scott?
Go ahead.
Do we know who owns this building?
Yeah, it's developed by Maclow, Harry Maclow, designed by Raphael Vignoli. But I don't know if these gentlemen are aware of these codes in the building, and I would speculate that they might not be. I just think this is the way things happen. This is a very significant building. It's the tallest residential tower in the Western Hemisphere. If you don't count the controversial spire on the One World Trade Center, this would be taller than that building. So, very significant building. And when there is a building of such significance, somehow or other, these codes get into it. And you could say, oh, well, it's all a conspiracy. It's, clearly these people are, doing this on purpose. Well, I'm not so sure. They might be, and I don't rule that out. But on the other hand, I've seen so many of these things that I speculate that these things just happen. And yet, it's not random. It's clearly designed. There's consciousness behind all of that. And the question is, where is that consciousness? Who is ultimately responsible for that? And I don't have an answer to that. I think it's just a gateway to asking more and more questions, more interesting questions as you go.
And I often think the more questions we ask, the more answers that we feel as opposed to learning. I'm a big believer in feeling, and quite often it's very hard to articulate a feeling, but you know what it is all the same. And I think, the more I look at your work, I found the same thing with the work of Marty Leeds and quite a number of, I suppose, alternative studies of Egyptology. I think there's just a feeling that things are harmonious and they're resonating at a particular level, and to me that feels right. And while I can't explain to the listener or to you, Scott, why it feels right or what that does for me on a physical level, I just know that it improves my outlook on life in general and how it is I live my life, and I think it just has a positive effect on me on possibly a subconscious level, or perhaps it's an interdimensional level, I don't know, but there is a positivity there that doesn't exist when that harmony isn't surrounding me. So I mean, very badly articulated on my part, but
no, I think that you're saying it, you're bringing up a point that I haven't really pondered much, which is essentially that there's a musical component to these harmonies that gives you a feeling like you might get when you listen to a great song.
Yeah.
You're just like, you're grooving with it. You're just, everything is right in the world, It's just a great
I think
song.
you're right.
And it's that kind of feeling you have, like, wow, just, I'm at the top of my game, And that's the kind of thing that you can almost get high on these numbers, in a very safe way that it, gets you in tune with the cosmos.
Yeah, I totally get that. And for anybody listening to us now saying, right, the lads are completely off the rockers, that's completely crazy, the example you gave there of music is a very good one. Imagine your favourite song. How does that make you feel? Well, it's making you feel that way for a particular reason, and there are so many different reasons, and it's up to us to discover those reasons for ourselves. And I think there's no doubt that the work that you're doing has that effect. It certainly does on me, and obviously does on so many people, because these patterns wouldn't exist otherwise.
Yeah, there's something that's already there, and I'm just noticing that a little bit. Here, I just came across this quote I want to read from my blog. Mm-hmm. At an average rate of 72 beats per minute, in 1 hour the human heart will have beat 4,320 times. In 12 hours, or 43,200 seconds, the heart will have beat 51,840 times. The Great Pyramid slope is 51.84 degrees. So there we have these cosmic numbers connecting with the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
Connecting with the human heart. We're just inextricably connected with these patterns. They're part of us. We have 33 bones in our spine, and so on. These patterns, once you start unraveling them and noticing them, they're just so interconnected with everything else. It's kind of a challenge for me. It's like when I have an interview or I'm making a new video, where do I start? Yeah. I could kind of start anywhere, and it will lead to everywhere else.
So, into the future, what is the plan, or is there a plan? Is it completely organic for you now at this stage, Scott? I mean, do you have a plan that you're going to write a book a year, or a book every 2 years, or is it just as you discover more and more, you decide to document them? What's the plan for the next couple of years, or months, or even decades, whatever it might be?
Okay, well, on one level, in terms of my research, I just sort of follow my inspiration wherever that might go. For example, this year, starting in January, I started making illustrations, and I just felt like I was on a roll. And I made so many illustrations. In 2 months' time, I had like 60 illustrations, and so it became clear that I needed to publish this as a book. And so that's how quantification came about, sort of organically in that way. But I also do some longer range planning and think about, okay, what am I going to do next? And I'm working on a television show right now, a series. So right now I'm in the early stages, but I'm hopeful that will reach a larger audience, because I think that right now Secrets in Plain Sight is really a niche audience, and I think it has a potential to be a little bit more transformative for people if they were to encounter some of these patterns. And so that's my hope with a TV show concept. I'm also writing a novel. I've written about a third of it, and I think that's coming along really nicely. And I don't really want to give the details on the novel or the TV show right now, because it's still so fluid. But those are kind of longer range projects that I'm working on. I also have to pay the bills, and I'm doing AutoCAD tutorial videos lynda.com, and that's a good way for me to take care of those practical realities.
Good stuff. And of course the books are available on Amazon. And tell us about your website as well, and any other plugs that you want to get in. We'll get them all up on the website too, on our Alchemy Radio website.
So I have two websites. There's scottonstott.com, and that's about my professional side. You can find all my tutorial videos there on different software programs and books. I've written 11 books on those subjects. And there's also secretsinplainsight.com. And there you can find my videos and books, and now I've added T-shirts to the mix also. So if you'd like to wear Secrets in Plain Sight, you can do that.
Hopefully you'll come back. I feel like we could chat for hours about this. It's just a subject that, again, that word, that resonates with me in particular. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the work that it is you're doing. So hopefully you can check in and we can have an even more in-depth conversation in the future. But in the meantime, Scott Onstott, it's been fantastic speaking to you. And best wishes to you and everybody in British Columbia. And of course, on the island, I forget the name of the island again that you're on.
Cortez Island, named after one of the world's most heinous conquerors.
he was certainly tuned to 440 as opposed to 432. Enjoy the rest of your sunny day, and we'll be in touch very, very soon. I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. Scott Onstott, it's been a